Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Salvador Badillo-Rios, an associate at the National Security Innovation Capital, NSIC. NSIC's mission is to strengthen the national security innovation base by addressing the shortfall of trusted sources of private investment for technology startups that are developing dual-use hardware products and materials. These are the technologies which have both commercial and national security applications. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we'll talk about the origins of NSIC, funding priorities, criteria for funding, application process, and insights into best practices for applicants. The funding from NSIC is non-dilutive, and I really hope you can benefit from this conversation. All right, Sal, from my own experiences in building hardware for my previous startups and working with other founders in the space, building a hardware startup is hard. And so glad to see that the Department of Defense has launched programs like the National Security Innovation Capital, NSIC, to support hardware development. And thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about NSIC.
Yeah, no problem. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So before we jump into the subject, maybe you can help us set the stage by talking about some of the biggest pain points that you have observed in building hardware and your interactions with founders.
Currently, the venture capital environment tends to focus a lot on software, and there are reasons for that. Hardware is often overlooked because there are unique challenges and risks associated with hardware. So, for example, there are high capital expenditures and upfront costs, right? So with software, you don't really have much of this issue, but with hardware, you have to pay for lab equipment, highly skilled researchers, workers, all that. And so that's a lot of upfront costs that with hardware, you need to take into consideration. Also, longer commercialization timeline, innovation life cycle. So it's difficult to see consistent exponential growth with hardware customers. And so success can be sometimes a little bit more sudden, a little bit less predictable. That can scare off a lot of VCs. Also, just the complexity of integration, right? And, within the development processes and into customer systems. Also, you have supply chain issues that can arise. And so a lot of delays in procuring raw materials, equipment, or parts. And so that adds to the complexity. Also, if something goes wrong, sometimes there's no quick fix. Maintenance and repairs can sometimes take a while, and it's not always as predictable. Testing can be pretty expensive or can be difficult to show progress. So all that needs to be taken into consideration. And so a lot of VCs tend to be scared or, shy away from funding hardware startups. And so as a consequence, sometimes these hardware startups need to look for foreign capital, for example, or foreign investment to get the capital that they need.
Yeah. All important points. And I think one other thing that comes into play is regulations. That is another huge pain point in the space. Thank you for covering that background.
Yeah.
We will come back to this theme of hardships in our conversation as we go through this one. But a good place to talk about today's subject is now about the National Security Innovation Capital. What is it all about?
So NSIC stands for National Security Innovation Capital. And so it's a program that addresses the shortfall of trusted funding from private venture capital sources. And so to develop new hardware technologies that have both commercial and national security applications. So we're looking at dual use. And so we try and identify these startups that are developing these dual use technologies that would benefit from government funding so that they can bring these products to market. The way it was formed, it was authorized by the National Defense Authorization Act in 2019. And this was in response to concerns that U.S. hardware startups were having trouble finding adequate capital from trusted U.S. sources. And so we started in 2021. I joined the team in March 2021. And so we've been going strong since then. And so we are an initiative within the Defense Innovation Unit, which I won't go into in too much detail about, but the contracting process leverages the other transaction authority, so OTA, that is already granted to and utilized by DIU.
First, let's start with something that you mentioned about dual use. What is the concept of why does it have to be both commercially be usable and also by the defense? Any insights into that?
Well, if you kind of look back in the history, a lot of innovation seemed to happen within the DoD. And then a lot of that got spun out into the commercial side, the commercial market. Now it's sort of the other way around, right? A lot of the innovation happens within the commercial markets. So the DoD usually has a little bit of trouble bringing in some of that technology just because there are a lot of barriers. The process can be slow, different regulations, and it may be difficult, implementing some of this technology and long lead times. And so it may not always be attractive to the founder. And so in order to bring that innovation to the DoD, the Defense Innovation Unit was formed. And so to cater to startups that are looking for dual use applications.
Yeah. Silicon Valley was started on the Second World War, and a lot of the uses were around defense uses, the semiconductors, the internet, the wireless, and I think they commercialized afterwards. Any insights into what got lost from that process where it was originally used for defense and then commercialized for other people? Why does DoD have to bring up programs like this where they can use both simultaneously? Any lessons learned from the first time around?
Well, like I mentioned, it used to be sort of the other way around. And so other countries, for example, China, it's sort of baked in right into the government, where if they're funding a specific company, there's a requirement that there's some involvement. The government is a customer for them. But in our case, we have to appeal to the commercial companies, to the startups. In this case, you have the primes that work with DoD. And so although that brings in a lot of technology from the commercial side, when companies are huge, a lot of innovation does not always happen. And so the innovation really starts at these small startups that can take that risk, but unfortunately they're overlooked. And so there needs to be a conscious effort to reach out to them and cater to them so that they can be interested in bringing in that technology to the DoD.
Indeed. And one of the point you mentioned about the funding and how founders were looking at international investors or not so trusted sources of funding. Where were these entrepreneurs going? Like, any insights into that?
China is one big one. If you look at China, they're investing almost as much into their hardware startups as the US is investing in US hardware startups. Although the US VC funding for US hardware startups is growing rapidly, most of that growth is going to later stage companies. Also, the US venture capital firms underinvest in early stage hardware companies. And so that limits the number of US suppliers and creates openings for these adversaries. Like you mentioned, in many cases, these hardware startups are having to turn to these foreign sources of capital, and they leave these startups vulnerable to the loss of intellectual property, to potential adversaries. And so China is one big one. That there are some others, but I would say that is sort of a main competitor there.
Definitely. I'm happy that the government realized this and then started investing in this space. Maybe this is a good point to talk about what aspects of hardware development has NSIC, NSIC identified as the biggest problem areas, and where are they investing in, if there are categories that you're investing in?
Currently, we have 5 topics of interest that we are looking at. However, we are continually looking at different technologies that are coming out and those that would be most suitable for the DoD. And we are very much open to adding or changing these topics of interest as time goes on. For now, the current topics of interest are autonomy, space, communications, sensors, and power. And so under these, we have different subtopics that may include different subsystems and subcomponents and parts. But the idea here is to keep the apertures broad and yet relevant so that there's wiggle room there, and we're not constraining ourselves so much. So in terms of power, for example, We're looking at novel energy storage chemistry. So this can include advanced battery systems, so maybe lithium, sulfur, or whatnot, and different conversion devices. On the sensor side, this may include also, for example, quantum sensors for position, navigation, and all that. So we have some very interesting topics that we're looking at.
Where do you get your applications from? Mostly, are there certain universities that are more active? Just wanted to get a sense of who's been applying so far.
I mean, I need to look to see in terms of like if there's a hub of like a specific university, but we get them from all over the US. So the one great thing is, now we're virtual. And so companies don't necessarily need to come in person for a pitch session or whatnot. And so the application process is online and any pitch sessions that happen are virtually. And so it sort of opens the door for companies to apply from all over the country. And our portfolio companies come from all over.
What is the selection criteria? Who is eligible to work with the program? What stage of the companies are you accepting applications from?
Yeah, so we have a set of criteria that we look for. We're interested in hardware startups. So if there's only software startup that applies, unfortunately, they would not qualify for our program. But the hardware startup that is not shipping product currently, that has dual use applications. So we need to see compelling arguments for both commercial and defense applications. So this can include conversations and interviews with potential customers, both on the DoD and commercial side, letters of intent, looking at particular use cases. We want them to have clearly differentiated their technology. And so this is a qualitative and quantitative comparison with related technologies and competitors and other startups. Minimum that we're looking for is a TRL 3 or higher, and that are not yet shipping product. They can be sort of at preliminary design, prototype, and testing, and provide associated data with that. This is not a deal breaker, but we prefer companies that have little to no professional VC investment. And the reason for this is, do you really need us, right? If you already have significant attraction from VC firms, then you may not necessarily need us, and that's okay. But if you're having trouble getting that attraction from VC, and that's where sometimes we can step in, right? You get funding from us, and then suddenly you can become more attractive to the VC firms and raise the funding that you need. Also, we want companies that are building an actual product and not just delivering research or an R&D service. And so there has to be a focus on bringing that first product to market. And so when we look for that, we look for companies that have an idea of who their customers are going to be, have thought through the supply chain and manufacturing, and how are you going to make money off of your product or related service off of that product. It's also important for us, to see that you have a clear product development plan and, understanding the risks, both technical, business, any team risks, if there are any appropriate milestones for the ask that you're making. And then, a strong team is definitely important. Both, do they mesh well, but also the relevant expertise. So this can be DoD experience. Some founders are veterans or have worked with the DoD or, in the DoD. Is their management experience, previous startup experience, or maybe they've owned a company or startup before and have sold that company. And then any technical experience, obviously that is relevant. So PhD or other degrees, worked at a national lab or DoD lab, R&D, industry, all that. And then you have to be US owned and based. So I would say those are our primary criteria.
Great. Thank you for that. You mentioned something about TRL 3, that's technology readiness level.
Yeah.
Maybe for some of the audience who doesn't know what TRL is, can you explain what these levels are about?
Yeah, so in the technology development stages, you go through different stages as you get to development. So TRL1 might be, looking at just the basic principles. TRL2 means, okay, you already have this concept more formulated and the application. TRL3, you have sort of an analytical and experimental proof of concept. And so as you get higher and higher, then you come to do more testing and validation, and up until you have an MVP or whatnot that you're ready to test or sell.
Great. Thank you for that. And one other point you mentioned was about doing customer research, and at some level, maybe reaching out to DoD folks and knowing much about the technology is very hard. Is there something that you do to facilitate those conversations if somebody's trying to apply? Or in other ways, what have the best entrepreneurs done? Like, what is the best way to do this research?
A lot of them have already had conversations. So whether they had conversations with an Army lab or some specific use case for their product. So we sort of do expect them to have already some conversations or have SIBRs or whatnot that demonstrate that there is interest from the DoD. So there are several ways of showing this, communicating with and reaching out to these people, getting SIBRs and whatnot, participating in the programs that the DoD has. And of course, once a company is within our portfolio, then we can help facilitate that as they grow and they're looking to expand their customer base.
Great. And maybe now is a good time to talk about the granting process itself. Let's start with the application process. Is there anything like a pre-application where they have to talk to the program manager or something, or they can just jump into the application and go talk about the timelines and the dollar amounts you grant for the startups?
Yeah, our process is pretty straightforward. So it's pretty easy. Companies come to us in a variety of different ways. Some companies simply apply online without us knowing anything about them. And so it's a fairly straightforward process. You put in your contact information and then you submit your pitch deck. Our website outlines the things that we're looking for and includes further detail on the criteria that we look for. Some companies reach out to either me through LinkedIn or via email or with one of our principals. And we may have a preliminary meeting just to see if we're at all interested in whether it's worth their time to apply or whatnot. Sometimes we get companies recommended to us or suggested to us via the connections that we have with incubators or accelerators or other programs, or even within the Defense Innovation Unit. There are different portfolios that focus on different technology areas. And so sometimes they'll find or come across a company that may be a little bit too early for them. And so they'll send it our way to see if it would be a good fit. Either way, all companies eventually apply through our website. So they come into our system. And I do want to know this is an open solicitation. So anyone can apply at any time throughout the year.
So there's no deadline of any kind.
Right. Yeah. There's no deadline and there's no specific use case that we're trying to pair. So it's sort of open-ended. And so it's sort of up to the person who's applying to really make their case in terms of the DoD use case. Then on our end, we're also aware of some of the important use cases and whether or not, there would be a good fit there. Or sometimes we will consult if we think the technology might be interesting enough. We might consult with someone within the DoD to validate and make sure that the use case is definitely there.
How does the review process work if it is like so open and anybody can apply on any topic? What happens at your end once you see the application there?
Yeah, so on our end, once an application comes in, we do have a minimum threshold criteria that we look at to basically weed out companies that clearly do not fit, with NSIC. So if a company is software, they're shipping product already, not US based, things like that. I'll automatically weed those out. And so they will not make it past sort of a certain point. But for those that do make it past that point, then there is a stage one preliminary evaluation. And so companies are screened against the standard criteria that we have. And so we as a team discuss these evaluations and we decide whether or not they move forward based on that criteria.
NIH and NSF, we know mostly professors and a few business folks are the ones reviewing them. I'm trying to understand what is expertise level at your end, because some of them are deep tech and you might need some expertise there.
I mean, we have people from a variety of backgrounds. For example, my PhD background is aerospace engineering, focusing on rocket engine research. And so I can bring that expertise to the table. But there are people on our team who have other technical experience, whether in communications, space, power, whatnot. Some of us have business background. So, a lot of the people on my team, MBAs, and then also some operational experience. So any issues related to supply chain, we probably already have a lot of experience with that. In the cases that we may not have the relevant technical experience or background or may not quite give as much feedback as we want, we do have the option to reach out to subject matter experts that we have on hand or with other people within DIU that may help. And so we take advantage of those resources when we make a determination. After that preliminary evaluation, those that do move forward, they reach a stage 2. And so this is where they're invited to present to us virtually at a pitch session. And so sometimes they'll update their pitch deck or whatnot based on the feedback that we'll give them. And then, they'll present to us and we will ask questions. And this could be on the technical side, business, team, go-to-market strategy, whatever we may be unclear of or unsure of. And the point here is not to, intimidate them or anything. It's really to just get the information, all the information that we need in order to make an educated decision. And assuming a company passes that stage, then they go through a due diligence phase where there's a deeper scrutiny on their financials and everything. On the technical side too, sometimes we may still be a little bit unclear, or whatever we may have concerns about, we'll dive deep on that. And then if they pass that stage, then the funding committee approves them to move forward. We sit down with them to write a statement of work, and there's contract negotiation that happens, and then they're awarded funding.
What is the timeline like from the time you see an application to time when they make the decision and give the money? How fast or how slow?
I mean, that can vary. At least in the first screening stage, that's pretty quickly. It's done within the first week or two, usually. Stage 1, eval can take a little bit further. I would say the main holdup is usually in the due diligence phase, just because we really want to make sure we've covered all our bases. And so sometimes that can move a little bit speedy, sometimes not. But what we aim for is to go on the timeline of a few months from time of application to award, as opposed to years or whatnot, where typical DoD process can take.
Yes, that's one of the biggest complaints we entrepreneurs have with NIH and NSF. It just almost takes a year for you to see the money.
Right.
And it's a matter of survival at that stage.
Right. And so we're very cognizant of that, right? Timing is important. And so we try and do our best. And sometimes we do better than other times, but we try and do our best to get to you guys that speedy timeline. Even if it's a no, right? It's better to hear a no quickly than wait a while and then hear a no. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you guys are much faster than the other big organizations. Yes.
Yeah.
And we didn't talk about the dollar amounts. Like, what is the funding level that the startups get?
Typically anywhere from 500,000 to 3 million or so. Again, this can depend on our budget and the companies that we're considering at the time and what the need is. When we look at funding and the ask, we look for strong product development plan and clear milestones that are tied to the ask, so that we have an idea of where our money is going and how it's going to be utilized. But yeah, anywhere from 500,000 to 3 million.
Wow, that's a nice chunk of money.
Yeah.
Maybe I should go back to something that you mentioned earlier about, like, you sit down with the founders to write the statement of work you mentioned. What happens in that process? I'm guessing like somebody at the user end is going to be a part of those meetings. Like, shed some light on that, please.
I'm personally not usually involved in that process, but from my understanding, it's usually the company that really takes the lead on making the statement of work. Because in the end, they're the ones who will be doing the work, have an idea of what they need to accomplish and how much funding is needed. We are involved in the sense that we take a look and we make sure that this is going to make sense, that a particular item or milestone seems feasible and the funding required seems appropriate. We try and work together with them. We're not dictating anything here. And so it's a very collaborative process.
Thanks for that clarification. So what happens after they get funded? I'm assuming there'll be a timeline where they have some milestone to deliver. Does NSIC get involved in the progress, or do you provide any support in that?
One great thing about NSIC is obviously we give funding out to these companies to accelerate their product development. And sometimes we help with adversarial investment and pushing that away. But we provide more than that, which is suitable for the founder. So even just before they get awarded, a lot of companies have come to us and told us that just by going through our application process, their pitch deck, and through the pitch session, that has allowed them to gain clarity and help polish their pitch, their product development plan, go-to-market strategy. And so all that has been invaluable to them, even if they did not get an award. And so just by going through the process, a lot of these companies have learned a lot. And so by the time they are awarded, they usually have a lot of clarity on these items. As far as what we do once they get awarded, usually the principal has an ongoing relationship with each portfolio company within their technology, within their topic of interest. And so we meet regularly with them to track progress. This can be like on a bi-weekly basis, for example. And as I mentioned before, we have technical background, business background, and or operational experience to give advice on some of the technical challenges that may arise or supply chain delays. So this can be very helpful to the company. As I mentioned, also when appropriate, we can connect portfolio companies to other DoD folks or organizations, can make them aware of relevant VC firms when they're ready to raise funding. And so that can be very valuable to a company because they are portfolio companies, right? They're like our baby. So we are invested in these companies, not just with money, but, with our time and making sure that they succeed, because if they succeed, then we succeed.
Does any startup come to your mind that you were personally satisfied by the way you helped them and they were able to make a lot of progress? I just want to hear some stories.
There's several that we've had. One, for example, is Anthro Energy. And so they are under the Power TOI. So this is a flexible lithium ion prototype development. And so they didn't get significant amount of money from us, right? 580K or so. This is a period of performance of 18 months. So usually our period of performance is around 12 to 18 months. So they're focusing on developing a flexible and conformal lithium ion battery that will remain functional and safe even when punctured, cut, or torn. And so this is a polymer-based electrolyte that enables full bending of the battery and can provide self-healing properties. And so they've been very great and have done a lot of progress and have just recently raised more funding. And so that's one company that's been very successful.
Wow, fascinating. Some of the stories I get to hear about the new technology is mind-blowing. And I'm so glad they're receiving the support. On the subject of the funding, I read on your webpage that you award other transaction OT agreements. What does that mean, OT agreements?
That's the process by which companies get a contract. So there are different ways that the DoD can provide a contract to customers. And so that's just the avenue that we are choosing.
Okay. Do you come in with any follow-up funding? Like VCs go for Series A, B, and C. Does NSIC get involved in future rounds of funding?
No. So typically our goal is to make them more attractive for VC funding. And so our goal is to help with that value of death of product development to commercialization. However, that is sort of one metric that we will be looking at. Right now, all of our portfolio companies are still in their period of performance. And so we're not quite there yet, but we do plan on tracking whether they become attracted to VCs and how much funding they get. However, in some rare cases, we are open to providing follow-on funding if they need for further product development or for commercialization, and then they can be more attractive for VCs at that point. It really depends on the capital that is needed on the company, and so every company is different and every need is different.
I know this is a very young program. Have you seen a case where you have invested in a follow-up round?
We have not done that yet. We are considering that with maybe a company or two, but no decisions have been made.
Okay. Maybe that's a good point to talk about adoption, like this dual use case. And can you talk more about how that adoption into whether it is DoD or any of the government departments, how does that adoption work? Do you have a plan in place, and what can an entrepreneur look forward to in terms of maybe selling the product to DoD?
NSIC is on different timeline for that. So I guess I can briefly go over the different programs. So NSIN usually focuses on helping researchers that are looking to spin out their technology from the university to a business. We focus on companies that already have a Tier L3, already have a business already set, and are looking for that product development and have that product to sell to commercial customers and eventually DoD. And so make them attractive for VCs. And then the core DIU focuses on what you're talking about, which is a transition from commercial to DoD customers. So these are usually companies that are a little bit more mature, already have VC funding. And so at least the way core DIU does that and addresses that is So theirs is not an open solicitation. So they have specific AOIs that they post on their website. So they consult with DoD, they find a specific need, and then they post a specific solicitation catered to that need so that these companies can apply and fill that need. And so then they work on helping transition that technology to that specific DoD customer in mind.
Okay, so the other departments and their asks are more specific than an open-ended solicitation for proposals there.
Right.
Let's slightly shift gears and talk about the IP. Who owns the IP coming out of these programs when you fund them?
So the companies own the IP. So we're not taking any intellectual property. Often, because some of these companies come from the university setting, then they have to negotiate that with the university. But we do make sure that they own their IP and that they have that control. We don't want other companies, right, coming in and, taking that technology or whatnot. But we personally are not interested in taking that IP.
One other question along those lines is, what can the money be used for? Can they use the money to file patents? Are there any restrictions on use of the money?
Yeah, no, there's no huge restrictions on that use of the money. I mean, a lot of it has to go into that product development. And so it's really what is needed to develop that product. And that can vary by company. Some people, they may be looking to hire some technical talent for a specific portion of that product development. And other people may need to procure raw materials or whatnot, or invest in some manufacturing process. So it all varies. There's no restrictions on that.
You must be interacting with so many founders here on this platform. What have you learned from some of the entrepreneurs? Are there any takeaways in your tenure?
Yeah, I would say in terms of maybe tips, I guess.
Yes.
One thing that I have noticed, and this goes especially for the heavily technical teams, which, don't get me wrong, they're very brilliant and there's a lot of innovation that's happening. But I feel like sometimes they can focus so much on the what and not enough on the why. And so really honing in on that problem statement, what issue are you looking to solve and why should we care? And how pressing is it? That has to be conveyed related to that, well thought out use cases. I would say the way you can do this is showcasing that you've had conversations and interviews with potential customers. And not only that, but then you've received feedback from them or will receive feedback from them. And so this basically influences the design choices that you make, the technical specifications. So it's important throughout your pitch to weave in and keep in mind that user of your product. Another thing is go-to-market strategy. So what are your initial markets? Which one do you plan on penetrating first and why? Why not another one? What success metrics, will you have in mind to determine that, okay, this is going well? And what are the channels that you plan on using to reach these customers? And then lastly, I would say having a strong product development plan and clear milestones, because hardware in itself is complex, right? And you're dealing with a lot of moving parts at the same time. And so making sure you thought things through and had concrete milestones so that when you are asking for funding, we have a clear idea of the trajectory and how you plan on using that money.
Great advice. I'll connect back to that question about how you can use the money. Can you contract some of the work to other partners if you don't have the capabilities? How does that work? Are there any restrictions on that?
There may be a restriction on that. I'll have to check on you. I'm not entirely too clear on that.
Okay.
I'll have to look into it and get back to you.
That's fine. I can plug it into the show notes if you have something for me later on. What do people get wrong on the applications? I know you talked about the GTM strategy, and I know scientists and engineers love the technology. They focus so much on that. Are there common mistakes that you have seen that people can avoid in the application process itself?
I mean, really, it's a lot of what I mentioned before. I would say really take the time to look through our website and through the criteria that we look for, because we outline that in our CAO document. All that is outlined. Sometimes you may have to, look through it in detail, but our process and what we look for is clearly outlined on there. We find that sometimes a lot of companies just don't include some of that basic information. I would say take the time to cater your submission to us, because it's very evident when we see submissions that were probably meant for another program. And I get that a lot of founders, right, are busy and they're trying to get as much funding as possible and they want to reuse a lot of things, but we can clearly tell when a submission was not tailored to us.
Yes.
One thing that we look for is risks and mitigation strategies. And so that really tells us if you've really thought through some of the technical risks, the business risks, and what level of risk this is and how you plan on addressing that. Doesn't mean you need to have everything perfect or that everything is set in stone, but at least knowing that you've thought through these things definitely makes your case stronger.
Absolutely. I don't think too many people focus on that risk mitigation aspect of it and thinking through long term.
Right. It's usually overlooked or breezed by. And I think that's very important information that we're looking for.
Yeah. I think that's such a great, thoughtful exercise for the founders themselves too. Like, just think what all can go wrong if anybody's going to get harmed by this and things like that. And write down for clarity purpose. That'll definitely give an edge to people.
Right.
Great. Sal, I know you've been very generous with your time. Are there topics that we haven't discussed today about NSIC?
I guess one thing I'll mention, I think I mentioned it before, but we're here to help with product development for these early stage startups and also make them more attractive for private VC investment here in the US, and also blocking adversarial investment, which in some cases we have done, and that definitely helps the founders and also us and the confidence we have in them.
Great. And how would one contact you?
There's a website, so you can feel free to look through our website, and we have an email there, an inquiry email there, or you can also feel free to contact me personally. And so that is at sbadillo-rios.ctr@tiu.mil.
Okay. I will have a link in the show notes for people to access. But Sal, thank you so much. This has been very educational for me. I didn't know a lot of these things. I'm sure some of your audience will appreciate this. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. No problem.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.